Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very big welcome to the official launch of the African Development Bank Group's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report 2025. It is a great honor to both MC and moderate this session this morning. My name is Victor Oladokun, and it's great to be in Addis Ababa, the diplomatic capital of Ethiopia, and a country that is increasingly in the middle of global crossroads. If you haven't visited Ethiopia in just 6 months, I think every single time you come back here, you'll be amazed at the amazing transformations taking place in this beautiful city and in this beautiful country. Today, Africa stands at a defining crossroads in its economic and development journey. But, needless to say, I like to believe that this is a great time to be alive in Africa. There hasn't been a better time than now in spite of the challenges that we do face. Today, Africa navigates an increasingly interconnected and dynamic global landscape, one that more than ever is marked by economic shocks, geopolitical shifts, climate change, and regional conflicts. As such, this much-anticipated report is a critical compass, it's a roadmap, and a strategic document for policymakers, investors, and development partners. As you're about to hear in the minutes that will follow, it identifies critical trends and tailwinds that can propel Africa forward and headwinds that we must overcome as a continent. We're privileged to have with us today some of Africa's most distinguished economic minds, policymakers, diplomats, and thought leaders. And their responsibility this morning will be to help us unpack the insights from this report and explore practical, forward-looking strategies to accelerate inclusive and sustainable growth on the continent. To set the stage, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, for this power-packed session, let us turn our attention to the screen for a very short video that provides a bird's-eye view of Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook for 2025. Thank you.
In 2024, Africa's growth matched the global average. In 2025, it is expected to surpass it, making Africa one of the fastest growing regions, surpassed only by Asia. Yes, Africa shines as one of the most exciting regions. Energy, tourism, agriculture, and private investments are driving growth in several African countries, with some boasting gains of more than 1 percentage point. While the continent's growth held steady at 3.2% in 2024, it's expected to ramp up to 4.1% in 2025, setting the stage for an important year. Each region is forging its own growth path. East Africa leads the way with projected growth of 5.3%, thanks to the dynamism of diversified economic activities in countries like Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Growth projections for West Africa stand at 4.6%, and many of the region's countries are expected to grow by 5% or more in 2025. Central Africa is set to maintain a 3.9% growth rate, driven by advances in the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. North Africa, bouncing back, also anticipates growth of 3.9%, fueled by recoveries in Egypt and Morocco, despite continuing regional challenges. Southern Africa is on track for the strongest growth since 2021, at 3%, with Eswatini, Zambia and Zimbabwe recovering from last year's drought. However, progress comes with challenges. Africa's projected growth in 2025 is, however, 2.9 percentage points lower than the 7% needed to lift millions out of poverty. While inflation is easing, it remains in double digits at a projected 12.6% for 2025-2026. Public debt is stabilizing, but remains higher than before the pandemic as vulnerabilities remain elevated. Some of the solutions to tackle these issues include creating a more favorable business environment by leveraging regional integration policies and supporting national champions, pursuing and promoting franchising while leveraging the technological know-how, preemptively pursuing debt restructuring, adding value to critical and rare earth minerals. Africa stands poised at a crossroads. With 12 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies, 2025 marks the continent's return to dynamic pre-pandemic growth. This is Africa unleashed, bold, innovative, fearless, leading change, not following it. The future belongs to those who shape it. Africa's time is now.
An excellent video presentation there. Progress comes with challenges, but as we all know, the caveat is that there is no challenge and there's no mountain that's either too high enough that it can't be overcome or a challenge that is insurmountable. And the fact of the matter is, as we just heard in this report, the future is shaped. The future is what we make of it. It is never predetermined. Well, following that very insightful video presentation, it is now my honor to invite to the podium Mrs. Nnenna Nwabufor, Vice President, don't stand yet, of Regional Development Integration, don't stand yet, and Business Delivery at the African Development Bank Group. She's just in a hurry to get out of her seat and deliver. But one of the things I want to say is that Nnenna Nwabufor has had tremendous and diverse experience at the African Development Bank, probably more than 90% of the more than 3,000 staff members who call the bank home, and she brings with that a tremendous track record of excellent performance. Please give her a warm welcome this morning. Oh no, come on guys. I know you've had breakfast, you've had your coffee, we can do a whole lot better than that. The podium is yours. Can we give her a warmer welcome? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Big Brother Victor. I always thought I was running for election for president of the bank with that introduction. Only that I don't think my name was amongst the list that are being checked by the steering committee. You're all welcome. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to address you today on behalf of the African Development Bank Group President and Chairman of the Board of Directors, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, at the presentation of the 2025 edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook. Africa, like other regions, continues to grapple with multiple shocks such as tightening global financial conditions, geopolitical tensions, elevated public debt, persistent inflation, climate-related disasters, and structural bottlenecks. These challenges complicate policy-making and investment decisions, necessitating continuous reassessment of macroeconomic conditions in our various countries and across the continent. Against this backdrop, the 2025 edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook provides an evidence-based assessment of recent trends and short to medium-term economic prospects. While acknowledging Africa's resilience, the report advocates bold policy actions to sustain economic recovery and mitigate risks. My remarks today will focus on 5 key areas. One is the GDP growth and outlook. The second one is macroeconomic fundamentals. The third is sovereign debt dynamics, then domestic resource mobilization and policy priorities for enhancing resilience. On Africa's GDP growth and outlook, in 2024, Africa's average real GDP growth was estimated at 3.2%, mirroring 2023 levels, but below the 7% minimum required to significantly reduce poverty on the continent. Growth upticks were recorded in 30 out of 54 countries, largely driven by improvements in hydrocarbons, tourism, agriculture, and private investment. Looking ahead, Africa's GDP growth is projected to rise to 4.1% in 2025 and 4.4% in 2026. Supported by economic reforms, easing inflationary pressures, and improved fiscal positions. Notably, Africa is expected to be second fastest growing region after Asia, with 12 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies in 2025 being on the continent. However, despite these positive projections, regional variations persist and risks remain. A reversal in global disinflation trends and fiscal tightening in advanced economies could delay Africa's economic recovery. Now, on the macroeconomic fundamentals, inflation remains a key challenge. It's averaging about 18.6%. It averaged about 18.6% in 2024, far above the minimum, the medium-term target. Is expected to decline to 12.6% between 2025 and 2026 due to continued monetary tightening. Fiscal deficits widened slightly from 4.4% of GDP in 2023 to 4.6% in 2024, but is projected to narrow to 4.1% in 2025 to 2026, but is still above the 3% macroeconomic convergence target. Currency depreciation persisted in 2024 despite the easing of global financial conditions, reflecting that there are lingering monetary tightening in advanced economies, which is affecting our own continent. The current account deficit widened from 1.6% of GDP in 2023 to 2.4% in 2024, and these are due to trade deficits and declining net income. However, external financial flows rebounded by 8.7% to 207.9 billion in 2023, and this is driven by a reduction in net portfolio outflows. On Africa's sovereign debt dynamics, tight global financial conditions are slowly easing, aiding fiscal consolidation and debt reduction. Africa's median debt to GDP ratio declined to 60% in 2024 from 63.5% in 2021-2023 and is expected to drop further to 59.2% in this year. However, there are debt vulnerabilities that remain very high. Rising debt service costs are driven by global interest rates and a strong US dollar continues to strain our economies in Africa. As of September 2024, 9 African countries were in debt distress, with 11 others at high risk of debt distress. Debt accumulation is increasingly driven by exchange rate depreciation and interest expenses, with over 70% of Africa's debt denominated in foreign currency. External liquidity pressures are mounting, as reflected in the rising debt to service exports ratio, which increased from 22% between the years 2015 to 2019 to 29.2% in 2020, while it's estimated at 22% in 2024, is expected to increase to 22.7% this year. On domestic resource mobilization, African countries continue to struggle with revenue generation. Government revenue, excluding grants, fell from 23.1% of GDP in 2010 to 20.2% in 2022, mainly due to declining tax revenue, which dropped from 15.8% to 14.8% of GDP. And this is below the 15% threshold needed for sustainable development financing. This decline stems from inefficient tax collection, limited digitalization, and a large informal sector across the continent. Africa's tax to GDP ratio remains significantly lower than Latin America's, which is at 23.9%, and Europe at 31.7%. Therefore, strengthening tax administrations and addressing institutional inefficiencies are critical for improving domestic resource mobilization in our countries. Policy priorities for enhancing Africa's economic resilience. As Africa navigates an increasingly complex economic landscape, policymakers must adopt a forward-looking approach to reinforce resilience and drive sustainable growth. The macroeconomic performance and outlook proposes key actions for the short as well as medium to long term. Short-term priorities. One is to better calibrate and coordinate monetary and fiscal policies. Central banks should maintain contractionary monetary policy while governments prioritize social safety nets to protect vulnerable populations. The second thing is building foreign reserve buffers. We need to find a way to grow our economy in order to strengthen our reserves, and this will enhance resilience to external shocks and mitigate currency depreciation effects. Preemptive debt restructuring. Countries that are at high risk should proactively restructure debt to prevent distress and default, which will definitely cost the countries more. We also have some medium to long-term priorities. First of all is in investing in integrated infrastructure. Mobilizing domestic and foreign capital for infrastructure projects will boost productivity and economic diversification. The second is enhancing the business environment. Reforms, including modernizing regulations, improving standards, and supporting investment-friendly policies, will be essential for attracting private sector participation in our economies. The third one is fostering economic diversification. Supporting national champions and strengthening backward and forward linkages with small enterprises will deepen our domestic markets. And the fourth one is leveraging franchising and foreign expertise. We need to encourage cross-border investments and knowledge transfer to accelerate our industrialization on the continent. Number 5, reforming the international financial system. Addressing Africa's access to affordable capital is vital for sustainable development in Africa. And number 6, strengthening fiscal rules and transparency. We need to establish clear mandates for fiscal councils and debt management offices, which will enhance accountability and reduce fiscal distress for our countries. And lastly, improving domestic revenue mobilization. We have to enhance our tax collection systems, reduce inefficiencies, and adopt digital technologies, and we need to prioritize this in order to increase government revenue sustainably. In conclusion, 2 points. Africa's economic resilience and growth prospects remain strong, but challenges persist. Therefore, addressing inflation, strengthening fiscal policies, and ensuring sustainable debt management will be crucial for maintaining economic stability. Structural reforms and strategic investments will further enhance Africa's capacity to navigate global shocks and sustain long-term growth. Secondly, Africa has the potential to drive global economic expansion in the coming years, but realizing this potential will require decisive and well-coordinated policy actions by our governments. This may seem difficult, but it is not impossible if governments make it a key development agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nena Wabufo, for your compelling opening remarks and for setting the stage for what will no doubt be a very fast-paced tour de force of Africa's macroeconomic outlook. Up next, to shine the proverbial light on the 2025 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report and to lead discussions on its key findings, it's my pleasure, my honor, to invite to the podium, and again, I just say hold your fire for just a few moments, the Vice President and Chief Economist of the African Development Bank, Professor Chika Kevin Urama, who, along with his team, have worked long, hard, and tirelessly to put together what really is a brilliant, incisive, thought-provoking macroeconomic outlook report. So to him and to his team, we're truly indebted this afternoon. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, kindly give Professor Chika Urama a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, my brother, Victor Oladokun. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is really a big pleasure for me to, again, this year, for the third time in the row, to be presenting Africa's macroeconomic outlook, its performance, and the outlook for the future in this beautiful city of Addis Ababa. With this packed room and people standing up, it's already testimony to the interests we all have to see Africa continue on this trajectory of improving performance in macroeconomic policy management, public financial management, and growth, achieving the position of second amongst all the world regions. And actually, when you look in depth, as you will see in the report, you will find that even the first is just because of historical path dependency. If you look at the performance of the continent this year that we are looking at, Africa has really outperformed most of its other comparators in the world. So my presentation will run through this amazing demonstration of resilience and capacity to grow, even in the midst of global challenges that we are also going to talk about by African heads of states and government. And I want to start with saying, let's give them a big round of applause. Then we will look at the recent dynamics in Africa's macroeconomic fundamentals, a lot of which my sister, VP Nena, has already touched on. But more importantly, we look at the key tailwinds in the global economy that we need to harness as policymakers, as business owners, and as Africans. And also the headwinds we need to be aware of and manage in terms of the risks, downside risks that face the global economy and Africa's economy as we go forward. And then expound a little bit more on the policy recommendations which VP Nena has already mentioned. On the left here, you will see the growth performance of the continent since 2021. That red line there represents Africa's real GDP growth, estimated this year at 3.2%, slightly above the 3.4% we had in 2023, but definitely looking forward, we see that we estimate it will rise to 4.1% in 2025 and 4.4% in 2026. And 24 African countries, led by South Sudan, Djibouti, Niger, Rwanda, and Senegal, are expected to grow above 5% of GDP growth in 2025. And many of countries, including the one that is hosting us, Ethiopia, have done so well in the terms of GDP growth rates. Among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world this year, 12 of them are African. And Africa's GDP, even though it's growing at this high percentage rate, we also have to point out that it's not sufficient in terms of the quality of growth to create the amount of jobs we require in Africa, or also to break the endemic abject poverty, the vicious cycles of poverty that we have. And why is that? While Africa's population, real GDP is growing, the population is also growing. And therefore, Africa's GDP per capita has lagged the other regions as of its competitors, as we can see in this graph as well. So here, you see that the GDP per capita growth, even though it's going to double in the year 2025 and also increase further in 2026, this year it only increased by 2 percentage points, from 0.7% to 0.9%. And despite this growth in GDP per capita, as I've mentioned, it is not enough for us to be able to lift people out of poverty. But the good news is, our anticipation and estimations from our models show that by 2026, the African economies will be at par in terms of GDP per capita growth with Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. This, again, is impressive given where we're starting from. So, but we need a number of policies to be able to address the recurrent challenges that we have in the African economies. Another key point to make is that we have regional variations in the growth. That first aggregate picture does not paint the picture in all the countries. There are a number of individual countries in Africa that has been growing above the required 7% in several years, including in 2024. But the winners here for us will be East Africa. The Eastern Africa region, due to deep economic reforms that has been implemented, but also diversification of economies and so on, has grown rapidly. So the only region that did not see a recession during COVID-19, and since then, as you see in that graph, has continued to have an upward growth consistently. But another region I want to highlight is Southern Africa region. The Southern Africa region has been one of a concern because of the structural issues in South Africa that had dragged down the growth rates in that region of the country, of the continent. But today, we can see that last year and this year and next year is actually beginning to double the rate of growth in Southern Africa region, again because of a number of reforms that has been implemented. But other regions, West Africa, Central Africa, and North Africa, are also doing very well in terms of the growth trajectory being in the positive direction. Not for West Africa, a lot because of rebounding growth due to reforms that has been implemented by the current Nigerian government, the largest economy in that region. But we still have challenges in the macroeconomic fundamentals of the continent. Inflation continues to persist and go higher and higher. So we estimate this year that inflation is estimated to rise to over 18%. But in 2026, we are going to see, in 2025, it's going to come down to 12.6%, as already presented by VP Nenna. And the same way we have regional variations in growth, in the real GDP growth, we also had regional variations in terms of the inflationary pressures that countries in Africa has been undergoing during the past year. Compared to the rest of the regions, this is a key important point to make, that compared to the rest of the regions, the inflationary pressure in Africa has remained sticky despite active policies on fiscal consolidation and tightening monetary policy by our central banks and also by our finance ministries across the continent. Those red bars there show the inflationary pressures on the continent when you consider the trends over time. And exchange rate depreciation has been seen, based on this report, as the core driver of the inflation pressures that we have seen on the continent. Most of the countries in Africa saw rapid depreciation of its currency, domestic currency, because of appreciation of the value of the dollar. So this, again, is something that we really need to look at. And several countries in Africa saw uptick in inflation, as you will find in the report. But again, just like in other indicators, several countries on the continent also maintained stable inflationary outlook or even saw reductions in inflation over time. But the point to make here is that for a number of countries on the continent, we are above the required levels to maintain macroeconomic stability. On public debt ratios, we are also seeing a decline in the gross ratios of public debt to GDP on the continent, now going down, but still higher than the pre-pandemic period. And we see that the challenges that it creating that uptick in public debt has been what we continue to talk about, the spread that we have in the Africa's risk premium, with the continent paying about 3.5% more in terms of the returns, the rates of interest that we pay. And with this, Africa is losing about 74 billion US dollars annually. Again, this is why the decision of the African heads of states to implement an Africa Credit Rating Agency is a decision in the right direction. In terms of fiscal deficit, we're also seeing weakening in the fiscal conditions of countries. I'm not going to go into much depth because of the challenges of time. And so both in the fiscal and current account positions of the continent, we need to do a bit more. But the challenge is that also it's not internal factors only that is driving these challenges within the continent. So external issues continue to create pressures on governments on the continent. So if we try to look back, not just to think about 5-year term of growth on the continent, we see that some of these trends we're talking about in terms of challenges in the macroeconomic fundamentals of the continent is systemic. So we've seen episodic growth on the continent, maintaining about 4.0% per year for the past 2 decades. But we also see that this growth rate, despite being impressive, and we're saying it's second among the other regions, is not enough to create jobs or lift people out of poverty. And this is why with the African Union Commission and AUDA NEPAD, we'll be releasing a report tomorrow on key actions to be able to break these challenges that we'll continue to have on the continent. So the volatility in our GDP is because we continue to rely on commodities, and by nature, the global market price of commodities is volatile. So further diversification of our economies remain a key policy action that we need to continue to watch. External flows has also continued to decline. In terms of inflows to Africa, we have seen a rebound last year compared to what we talked about in 2024 MEO report, but FDI flows declined by 3.4%. Even our own remittances declined by 2.7% because of the new developments in the global policy arena that we see and different policies that are impacting our citizens that are in the diaspora, but also impacting financial flows to the continent. ODA also declined slowly, but it's beginning to return a little bit, but still the hoping for more ODA resources for Africa is, we need to be very, think about it carefully, especially with regard to the recent developments that we're seeing across the countries. So Africa continues to struggle to address one of the major issues that is the fundamental basis for economic growth everywhere, domestic revenue mobilization. And VP Nena has already talked about it and given us the figures. We require a minimum of about 25% of GDP growth, GDP in terms of tax revenue collection, and Africa is just about half of it, around 15% that currently. But again, this varies across countries, and even tax revenue, government revenue, is far too low to be able to drive transformation on the continent. So with all this picture, what are those upside and downside risks that we need to talk about? Ongoing disinflation in the advanced economies could come with some benefits for Africa, because again, even the inflationary pressures in Africa is sometimes due to imported inflation. And as conditions continue to improve, especially in the United States and Asia, our trading partners were expecting some pass-through effects in the coming years for the continent. Continued fiscal consolidation efforts can also bring some benefits or disbenefits, consolidation in the developed countries, but also in Africa could bring some benefits or disbenefits depending on how within the continent we marry our fiscal and monetary policy to ensure that the monetary policy stance is not going to be hurting growth, SME development, and general productivity increments within the continent. Now, we have seen successful debt treatments in some African countries, and that has led to better fiscal prudence amongst countries, and that's part of why we're seeing the debt to GDP ratio coming down. So if we continue in that effort and even do preemptive debt treatment and debt restructuring, not waiting for when we get into debt default risk, then we will be able to continue to improve the fiscal position of our countries. But stronger growth in the United States and Asia are two key areas that is supposed to be upside risks for Africa in terms of being tailwinds that can help Africa to move forward. But again, looking at recent developments in the United States, even that we need to be very careful about. So when we think about internally, what are then the downside risks? What are the headwinds we need to watch? Fiscal tightening and the looming debt crisis continue to be a balancing act for the countries in Africa. Because as we're continuing to see fiscal tightening policies on the continent, we are not seeing effective pass-through to fiscal sustainability on the continent or growth. But I have to say a word of caution. Sometimes the pass-through effects of these things take time. So there's need to continue with that fiscal consolidation and monetary tightening policies, but we need to watch the balance between effects on citizens, but also effects on businesses as we make those policies going forward. I will leave deglobalization and the geopolitics of growth and fragmentation we're seeing as a last one, because for me, this is an area where Africa really, really needs to think carefully. We all know that the global financial architecture has not been favorable to the continent, but even that global financial architecture is dismantling itself. So what do we do as Africans in order to position ourselves in this time of crisis so that we achieve what our veteran, Kofi Annan, always said, not to let any time of crisis go to waste? So we need to think carefully about how, when we're hearing friendshoring, reshoring, America first, and all the other first, how we also put Africa first. So we need to think very carefully about such policies that will improve regional economic integration and improve macroeconomic prudence in Africa and boost regional trade, regional productivity, manufacturing, and others. But there are several policies we have indicated that to address this particular risk that you will see in the reports. But these geopolitical tensions and global and regional conflicts also has a lot of pass-through effects to Africa. And again, for me, the solution to that is very clear. Our heads of states and government, for example, have already agreed on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. We need to stop having discussions on ACFTA and just get it done. We don't have time, because time for technology transfer, the windows are closing. Time for capital flow into the continent, we are seeing continued decline if you continue to watch it. So while we still have time to build alliances, do our own friendshoring and reshoring, let's do it now and not continue to have discussions. But climate shocks also continue to be a systemic risk that affects the continent in two ways. We know that the physical impacts of climate change is costing Africa 5 to 15% of GDP per capita growth every year. This is huge, more than $7.5 billion every year, addressing climate adaptation and climate mitigation issues. But another point that is subtle is that interpretation and use of climate policy has become one of the major challenges and bottlenecks, that is headwinds for financial flows coming into the continent, into critical productivity boosting sectors like energy. So we also need to think about just transitions and how we relate with climate policy in Africa and how we engage with the rest of the world to ensure that those regimes of policies are not used to upend growth on the continent. But the persistent inflationary pressures is something we have already talked about. So what are the key policy recommendations if we look at this picture that we have talked about? Macroeconomic policy reforms continue to remain an important and, in fact, a sine qua non for a necessary condition for growth to be sustained on the continent. We're doing well on GDP growth, And we can also even do much better. As you will hear tomorrow, there are key actions that if we continue to take, we will continue this path of upward growth and be able to reach that 7% mark required to break the vicious cycles of poverty on the continent. I would just say if there's one key recommendation we need to take home from this report is that there is no substitute for sound macroeconomic policy management and creating stability in the policy environment of our countries. To address issues of inflation, we have very clear policies that need to be considered, and it depends on the situation in each particular country. So I encourage you to read the report so you get the more details on what we need to do. But on a broad scale, we're saying we need to coordinate monetary and fiscal policies to make sure that we are not upending productivity growth, SME growth, private sector development by continuing to increase monetary policy rate only to manage the inflation of the country. So balancing inflationary targets but also growth targets is a key policy that we need to think about in Africa. But it depends on which situations countries are in. So if you read the report, you can find what relates to your own country. To address debt vulnerability and refinancing risks, there are several things that need to be done. But again, the continent is ahead of the pack. One of them is that Africa is the only continent that doesn't have a financial stability mechanism to address debt refinancing risks, which today is costing the continent about $10 billion every year for the next 10 years. If you go even by 2030, it's continuing increasing. And that analysis is based on already contracted debt. So with more fiscal pressures and additional debt that accumulation on the continent, that refinancing risk challenges will also continue to happen. So we need to focus on debt productivity instead of debt sustainability. Debt sustainability is important, but debt productivity is even more important because if we think about the quality of debt and the returns to the debt, borrowing only for productive investments, then we turn our debt to a growth-enhancing investment rather than the issues of we continue to think about how to repay this debt. Because if you borrow to invest and the investments creates returns higher than the principal, you are in good business. So let's think about that. We also need to pursue preemptive debt restructuring. Let's learn from the examples of Zambia, of Ghana, and the countries that have been able to do debt restructuring in the past 3 years and the improvements in their fiscal policy prudence. Let's try to roll that out, not waiting for when it rains before we buy the umbrella. Accelerating capacity building in public financial management to ensure public prudence in the public finance management processes, from domestic revenue mobilization to budgeting to borrowing to macroeconomic fiscal policy management is fundamental. And this is where, again, Africa is ahead of the pack. Under the leadership of President Adesina and the board of the African Development Bank Group, we've established the Public Financial Management Academy. We've also established what we call the Africa Debt Management Initiative Network and also the Debt Management Forum for Africa, bringing all the stakeholders on managing debt and public financial management at all levels together to train, to provide technical assistance, and we're already seeing improvements that's happening in this. And then to address the current account deficit, we just need to strengthen the trade in manufactured goods, regional trade in manufactured goods. The proportion of trade, regional trade in manufactured goods in Africa today is about 6.3%. And this is 6.3% of about 15% of regional trade in Africa. It's too small. And we need to change the ACFTA to a platform that allows us to identify key potentials of particular countries in the continent where there's competitive advantage and also comparative advantage, and implement very clear policies that prioritizes Africa's goods and services. That's the only way to encourage production. So let's implement franchising, bringing foreign companies to come and invest in building those factories in Africa instead of extracting raw materials, but also let's implement what we have called preferred procurement policies. for African countries to prefer Africa's products in order to create demand and make these things to go forward. We also need to accelerate domestic revenue mobilization, as we have already heard, broadening the tax base, improving tax administration through technologies and everything, but also let us focus on improving the social contract between governments and citizens. We find in our research that why we have that low rates of tax collection on the continent is mistrust between citizens and governments. What do you use my tax for? And because of that, we have high levels of implicit tax on the continent for people providing electricity for themselves, providing water for themselves, and even roads, some of the social services that should be taken care of by government. So by improving this social contract, we expect that the tax base can be increased. Other policy recommendations include structural reforms to improve business environment and accelerate the pace of diversification and manufacturing in Africa. We also need to invest in integrated productive infrastructure, building the roads, the rails that connects Africa in order to ensure that we can reduce the cost of intra-African trade, because businesses will only do business if they find the environment favorable and cost-effective. But we also need to rapidly increase natural capital accounting, beneficiation, and value addition. Again, we just released a report at Baku on measuring the green wealth of Africa, championed by President Sassou Nguesso and President William Ruto and President Adesina. We have done some work that tries to estimate if only Africa takes more seriously its natural capital, valuing it, both the stocks and the flows, including it in the systems of national accounts and therefore estimations of our GDP. And we'll find that for some countries, GDP could quadruple or even more. For Africa, it will add almost 50-something billion US dollars already if we only took into account carbon sequestration of forests. But there are so many ecosystem services for which we can already measure through natural capital accounting that is not yet being integrated in Africa's GDP. More so, we find that many of the systems of national accounts in Africa are outdated, which means that we're comparing apples and oranges when you put your GDP figure at par with the others who have a basket of instruments, of items that are measuring is much more than yours. Yours will be less. So investing in national statistics offices to ensure that they can be up to date in measuring our systems of in our systems of national accounts and rebasing GDP in this regard is a critical policy that can deliver immediate low-hanging fruits. But we need to also invest, create incentives and enhance the use of diaspora remittances. We find that diaspora remittances is the largest non-debt financing mechanism for Africa today. And for several decades, it has been. Today, we are saying it's declined, and it's declining to 95 billion US dollars, which is our FDI, ODA, portfolio investments is a fraction of that figure. But the challenge is that it's going into consumption smoothing. So the challenge to African countries is to create instruments that can securitize those remittances, enhance the use of diaspora bonds in mobilizing resources, build trust within this, with our diasporans outside, and create opportunities by building a more reliable and a stable policy environment to make them to even invest more. But through securitization, we can channel that to building human capital, creating businesses, and other things, basically financing Africa's development with Africa's own resources. I also urged reforms in the global financial architecture, both the debt architecture, but the capital markets, climate finance. We have already released reports showing that all these are actually, the resources are flowing in the reverse direction. My closing words would be to say, the African Development Bank, under the leadership of the President Akinwumi Adesina, and also the African Union Commission, under the leadership, the Trade and ATIM Department, the Commission and Mushanga sitting here, we've all collaborated to do a lot of work on identifying what needs to be done for Africa to maintain this trajectory of growth and break the vicious cycles of poverty. And in all these studies, we find that it is possible. There are very many low-hanging fruits that already can put Africa's GDP even much higher than Asia. But the issue here is implementation. So we need to focus on implementation. I've highlighted some of those reports on measuring the green wealth of Africa, and also a report on the key strategic actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa that will be launched, that will be presented tomorrow, and then also the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism that will also be presented tomorrow. So what we do in the African Development Bank, we identify, we analyze Africa's economies, we identify the challenges, but we also liaise with the relevant stakeholders, national governments, the African Union, and our development partners to create solutions. Let's use them.
Task, but one that was delivered exceptionally well. Thank you, Professor Rama, for an in-depth analysis and for adding further context and texture to the macroeconomic outlook for 2025, as well as unpacking some of its key findings. Just to paraphrase in my own non-economic way, in a dynamic global environment, one that's moving at the speed of light, there really is an urgency of now for an Africa-first development agenda. While not taking the critical role of our development partners for granted, the bottom line is this: Africa cannot outsource its development agenda to the benevolence of others, no matter how well-meaning. And there are already sufficient examples, as you said in your report, to indicate that this is quite possible. At this point, I'd like to invite to the podium several very distinguished panelists for a photo op and the official launch of the report, a symbolic moment that underscores our collective commitment to leveraging data-driven insights to shape Africa's economic and development trajectory. Following which, our distinguished guests and launchers will take their seats on the platform for our panel discussion. Kindly give a very warm welcome, and I said a very warm welcome, not a tepid welcome. This is a beautiful city, a great morning. Please give our panelists a really, really warm welcome as they come forward. His Excellency, Mr. Ato Ahmed Shide, Minister of Finance of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. His Excellency, Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals at the African Union Commission, one of the commissioners with the largest portfolios at the African Union. And of course, Professor Chika Urama, who we've just heard from, Chief Economist and Vice President at the African Development Bank, as well as our very distinguished Mrs. Nenna Nwabufo, Vice President, African Development Bank, Dr. Matei Maruping, Chairperson, the African Risk Capacity Group. Thank you very much, sir. And Dr. Almayehu Tafese, Program Leader, International Food Policy Research Institute. That completes our list. At this point, I will hand over proceedings to Labo. Oh, yes, absolutely. Let's attribute that to a function of the head and not of the heart. I'm going to ask VP Beth Dumford to also come forward to complete the mix. I believe that we have the, we've actually got the physical unveiling here, and copies will be distributed shortly. To the Chief Economist, I trust that tomorrow we'll have QR codes for those who also want digital copies, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure a lot of you, our guests, are chomping at the bit to go through the document. At this point, I hand over to the Chief Economist for the rest of this unveiling. Over to you. Okay, excellent. So again, we're going to try and move at the speed of light. All one has to do really is look around and see the very fast-paced infrastructure development that's taking place in Ethiopia. We heard earlier about the very robust GDP growth in Ethiopia, which is about 6 to 7%, depending on which numbers you're looking at. And you certainly have one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. And you've been able to do this in spite of strong growth, in spite of numerous shocks. So, my question to you, Your Excellency, is what specific homegrown economic reforms have been responsible for this? What is it that you're doing that we need to pay attention to?
Thank you, our moderator, Excellencies, Ministers, Madam Nina Nwabufwe, FDB Vice President, Excellencies, other Vice President as well, AU Commissioners, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to join this distinguished panel to reflect on the report launched by African Development Bank on macroeconomic outlook of Africa. I just want to reflect first on the report. The report is informative, rich in analysis, and bold in its discussion of policy implications. It underscores the fragility of Africa's economic growth, which is projected to hover around 4% in the near term. So we need to keep an eye on our growth. This stands in sharp contrast to the 5% or more growth rate the continent registered in the last 2 decades before the recent multiple global shocks, including COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and internal conflict in some parts of Africa. The report also highlights persistent macroeconomic instability in many countries, with inflation averaging 19% and the fiscal deficit reaching a record 4.6% of GDP since the pandemic. Debt remains a pressing challenge, and the risk is growing. A lot of countries are facing debt distress. So I think a coherent and consistent policy and homegrown solution for our economic issues is very much important. Regarding the recent Ethiopia's macroeconomic management, since Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed came to power almost 7 years ago, Ethiopia is embarking on a comprehensive macroeconomic reform agenda, economic opening up, economic reform, where we are rebalancing the role of the state in the economy. We are moving towards private sector-led development, diversification of our source of growth, enabling the private sector, and public sector efficiency enhancement has been the major agenda of the whole government. Ethiopia, like many African nations, has endured global and domestic shocks. However, what sets us apart is bold steps we have taken to restore macroeconomic stability, build resilience, and accelerate growth. Particularly, Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed has been championing a comprehensive development agenda where diversification of source of growth, enabling the private sector, enhancing the efficiency of public sector overall, both budgetary performance, the quality of spending, as well as also the reform on public sector enterprises. Last year, we launched phase 2 of our homegrown economic reform, which is aligned with our 10-year development plan. This reform directly addresses macroeconomic challenges and charts a path for sustainable growth. Our efforts have received support from IMF and World Bank and other development partners, including the G20 Common Framework, to address our external debt burden. Ethiopia has embarked on most comprehensive macroeconomic reform in its the last 6 years. We are shifting from administratively determined to a market-driven exchange rate and a monetary policy. This is first of its kind in our history, which is a very bold initiative. We liberalized our exchange rate. We are opening up the banking sector. We are opening up most of the sectors to both foreign direct investment so that competition and external investment can be enhanced. We are also working on revenue mobilization. Fiscal policy is also very important. Domestic resource mobilization has been the major agenda of the government. In addition to that, we are also working on transformation of public enterprises. Ethiopia has one of the largest public enterprises in Africa, like Ethiopian Airline, which is very much efficient. We have a shipping line. We have a biggest telecom operator. We have also a biggest bank, commercial bank of Ethiopia, and other major government enterprises. Their efficiency has been enhanced, and through that, there has been significant economic dividend. As a result of this macroeconomic reform and diversification of source of growth and enabling private sector-led growth, we had a lot of successes. Particularly, inflation has dropped from around 24% to 15% this time. Foreign exchange reserve and FDI inflows have improved significantly. Our tax revenue has significantly increased, strengthening our fiscal position. We need to do more in terms of tax to GDP ratio, but in terms of absolute collection, there has been significant effort. We are also working on social protection programs, which has been expanded significantly as a result of the exchange rate liberalization and the new monetary policy. We are subsidizing fuel, fertilizer, medicine, essential goods, so that the poor can be protected from the reform. Real GDP has grown last year 8.1 percentage point. This year we are expecting more than 8.4 percentage point of real GDP growth, which is a very significant. You can see in Addis Ababa the massive expansion in terms of infrastructure of the city, development of the city, urban renewal, so that the city will be beautiful, clean, green, as well as livable, and the mobility is ensured, and also basic urban infrastructure is to the standard. This is not only in Addis Ababa, it is also in all parts of Ethiopia. And the diversification of source of growth, both in urban development as well as agricultural development in rural areas and mineral sector development, has been a major source of growth in the economy. So Ethiopia, with its size, now is the biggest economy in the region. With the current macroeconomic reform, we are expecting significant investment, expansion in the growth capacity in the economy. And as a result of that, we expect Ethiopia will continue to be the engine of regional economic integration, regional economic pillar, and stability. I would like also to really thank African Development Bank. I take this opportunity to commend our strong partnership with the African Development Bank, which has reached new heights under the leadership of President Azed Adesina, to whom we express our deepest gratitude and the leadership. While this may be his final term, we are sure of him that Ethiopia will continue to be his friend, and he's always welcome to work with us. He's going to be a global voice for African development, so he's always welcome to work with us. Currently, the African Development Bank has a commitment exceeding 1.2 billion in regional integration projects, in agro-industrial parks, entrepreneurship initiative, job creation, and youth and inclusive growth, and also on wheat production. And Ethiopia is working with African Development Bank in regional integration projects. Regarding global financial architecture, I think we need to do more by ourselves now. Global partnership is important. Reform of global financial architecture is very important. We need to attract to the maximum quality resources for African development, but we need to do more also domestically.
Allow me to come back to you again, Honorable Minister. But I think that, again, is an excellent overview of what Ethiopia is doing to bring it to its current situation, again, with a projected GDP growth of 8.4% in 2025. Extremely impressive. Macroeconomic stability and reforms, public sector reforms and efficiencies, enhancing the role of the private sector, liberalization of the exchange rate. If you followed Ethiopia's history over the last 20 years, you'll realize how critically important that is and how difficult it has been. Efficient public enterprise efficiencies, including Ethiopian Airlines, and thank God for Ethiopian Airlines. Many of us probably wouldn't be here today. And for those of you who don't know, Ethiopian Airlines is the oldest airline company on the continent and still growing strong.
One of the oldest globally as well.
Also globally, and one of the largest purchasers of Boeing jets globally, social protections, and the list goes on. So we say congratulations to you. In the wings and virtually is Mr. Sidi Keita, His Excellency, the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs in the Gambia. Well, your colleague from Ethiopia has laid down the gauntlet. In 2023, you had a GDP growth of 5.3%, 2024, 5.7%. In spite of multiple shocks, Gambia still shows itself to be extremely resilient. And I know that you have ambitions to do a whole lot better than that in 2025. Again, our Honorable Minister has laid down the benchmark for us here today. What is it that you've done in the Gambia to overcome the shocks in terms of your policies? And what do you expect in the near future, growth-wise? Over to you.
Yes. Good morning, moderator, Honorable Minister, the staff and senior management of the African Development Bank, and all the other participants present. It is my pleasure to participate in this launching of the African Economic Outlook, and to share our experience of what we have been doing as a country. We have, as has been rightly mentioned, grown by 5.7% in 2024 on the backdrop, despite the challenges and shocks. And this was made possible through our own national policies, as well as working with our development partners, particularly the African Development Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, and other bilateral agencies that have been supporting us in our development agenda. But when the shocks took effect, we realized as a country that the only way is to look inward. Our development needs are challenging and huge. Meanwhile, the inflows of assistance is dwindling over time. So we have approached our solution to the challenge, to the shocks, on multiple prongs. The first of which is the focus on the domestic resource mobilization. We have emphasized that if you look at our share of revenue, tax revenue to GDP, we were hovering below the sub-Saharan African average, and that of those numbers of the OECD. And how do we address this? We look at digital solution to the revenue mobilization. And on this note, I hasten to place on record our appreciation to the African Development Bank for helping finance the ASCUDA wall, which is the revenue collection of customs through a digital solution. With this ASCUDA wall, the Revenue Authority, that is the GRA, has been able to digitalize its revenue collection, bringing in more efficiency and compliance into the customs aspects of revenue collection. This has helped us increase our revenue dramatically. And as we speak, our revenue collection has increased by more than 100% over the last 5 years. And specifically in 2022, our domestic revenue collection was 11.67 billion. But in 2024, we closed on 20.8 billion, an increase of more than 76%. And we also look at the spending aspect of our national resources. We have introduced a new procurement law, that is the revised Gambia Public Procurement Act, to ensure public expenditures to be more transparent and value for money. This has enhanced the expenditure of the public resources and ensured that we had more value for money. So with that, we have seen efficiency in the public expenditure, and also it has given opportunity to a number of SMEs and other new participants to come into the procurement arena. The other reform we had embarked on was the public sector reform through the reforms of our state-owned enterprises. A new state-owned enterprise law was promulgated, and this focused on the financial performance and governance of these SOEs. As we know, over the history, these state-owned enterprises have been a drag on the public resources, in the sense that their performance had been below par, And it get to a point government had to bail out a number of state-owned enterprises. So an independent state-owned enterprise commission was put into force, and they are there to enhance the performance of the state-owned enterprises to the level that we expect pretty soon. And we've seen early signs of success that the state-owned enterprises are acting up and their financial performance is improving.
Honorable Minister, allow
yes.
me to quickly jump in and ask you a question here. You did say that on account of dwindling inflows, there's been enhanced domestic resource mobilization. I'm just curious, how have you been able to do this while ensuring that the burden for that does not impact the most vulnerable in your country? Of course, you've had tremendous success here, but how have you been able to do that?
Yeah, what we did is to broaden the tax base and to increase the efficiency. For your information, we have not increased the tax rates. Rather, what we did, we bring in more compliance network, data matching, to ensure that all potential participants in the economy that are entitled with tax come under the tax net. This has taken a number of very important results. As, for example, some of the large contractors that were exempted or were not within the tax radar have now come under the tax radar, and this has substantially increased. So we are very mindful of the vulnerable segments of society, and for the information of the audience, even our basic income tax rates, the minimum threshold has been increased from 24,000 per annum dollars to now 36,000, just to ensure that the tax compliance is not adversely affecting the vulnerable. But meanwhile, focusing on large taxpayers and other economic activities that were outside the tax net earlier. Those are the measures we have taken, cognizance of the fact that the enhanced revenue collection should not adversely affect the vulnerable segments of society.
And in addition to that, Honorable Minister, enhanced domestic resource mobilization is actually important, it's key, but in tandem also is very transparent and efficient delivery of services. How critical has that been for you in Gambia, given the expectations?
Well, in fact, what we have done with the results of the rise in domestic resource mobilization, our investment in the public infrastructure space has increased. Our electricity connectivity and coverage has increased. And today, as we speak, our coverage of the access to electricity is 63% as of now, and we expect this to rise to almost 90% by the end of the year, with the ultimate objective of universal access. The second element of that is investment in the road infrastructure. Connectivity and connection has been very difficult in the past, but we have now relied on domestic resources to expand the road network. And this has resulted in very positive outcomes, with some of the travel times being reduced by more than half than before the development of the infrastructure. I'm sure some of the participants in the room would have recently come to the Gambia during the OIC summit, and they would have seen the new Batin Hadin Highway, which has actually reduced the travel time between the airport and Banjul by more than half. So we are also cognizant to ensure that as we are collecting the revenue, we are giving results to the citizens or increased service delivery. We are participating in the provision of school feeding from a government budget to the vulnerable segments of the country, and also ensuring that the vulnerable segments of the society continue to benefit from direct cash transfers, not just from donors, but also from the central budget of the Gambia. So this is how we are translating into action the results of the efficiency gains in the revenue collection. And of course, we are providing 100% free education from kindergarten to grade 12, all funded through the public purse. And we occasionally, depending on the fuel price at the global market, if the prices hike through the plant prices are very high, we also subsidize the fuel prices to ensure that the external shocks of the rise in fuel prices are not directly passed on to the society, which cannot cope with it. So these are some of the measures that we have been adopting to ensure that the citizenry continue to see benefits of the efficiencies that are being registered in the domestic resource mobilization space.
And based on these reforms, what are your projections for 2025 in terms of GDP growth?
Well, our projections for 2025 are about 6%. Where we have seen some positive wins already, as our entire economic activities have seen substantial increase. The efficiencies in the road network, the electricity access has given rise to the development of body entrepreneurs in places that were never able to be. For example, today, if you go up provinces, you can see machinery, carpentry, and welding workshops that were not possible in the past. And this has even been translated into a revised urban-rural migration, with some people even relocating back to their communities due to the access to the electricity and the good road network.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Just hold on for us for a second. We'll still come back again to you next. I want to go on to His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, who has done an incredible job over the last few years working with the African Development Bank on multiple fronts. We're really indebted to you, Your Excellency. We thank you really for the role that you've played and continue to play on behalf of the bank and on behalf of Africa. You have one of the largest portfolios of all the commissioners at the African Union. As we've said during these proceedings, we're at a crossroad, really globally. Geoeconomic fragmentation, rising protectionist measures are reshaping global trade and investment. We've heard about an Africa First agenda. These are there's significant long-term implications for where we are at the moment. Are you worried or are you optimistic? What's the future that you see, and what do you feel Africa should be doing at this time?
The world is unpredictable, and the challenge is a fact of life. Every day, new issues come up. The question is, how does one respond to those issues? And also, sometimes you need to look towards the future and try to foresee the developments and to say, how do I ensure that if these issues emerge, I'll be able to maintain the position that I have and safeguard my interests. Now, when we look at these geopolitical issues, since 2021, I've been sending a message to Africans, even the policymakers, that the era of aid as we know it today is coming to an end. And the reality before us is that some countries are now more or less doing away with institutions that were designed to channel aid. And other countries, we had a meeting of the Development Committee of the World Bank and the Commissioner for International Partnerships at the EU more or less said what I said, that aid as we know it has come to an end. Therefore, the answer is, how do we position ourselves to ensure that we are able to emerge out of it? So the question of domestic resources mobilization has been at the forefront, and we have working with the member states to ensure that, as indicated, they increase tax collections, they broaden the tax base, they digitalize, and they also eliminate illicit financial flows going outside Africa. And some of the countries, as indicated here, are doing quite well, but others have not yet been able to do it. That is the first point. The second point is that the issue of economic integration comes into play, very much so. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a good start, but we need to go beyond it because there is trade deflection in the free trade area. The best way to safeguard that is to come up with a common external tariff. So you need to move towards a customs union / common market. And we did come up with the readiness assessment towards an African customs union / common market. The ministers responsible for integration across Africa are looking at that document. So when we have that document, we're going to have a single trade policy for Africa, which is very, very, very good. And related to that is a question of macroeconomic convergence. When you look at the growth rates across Africa, they are not uniform.
Well, Ambassador Machanga, let me just jump in here, particularly with regards to the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Okay.
For a lot of observers who may not be fully integrated into the work of the African Union, we've been talking about Africa's integration for ages.
Yes.
But it's still not yet Uhuru.
Yes,
we're doing much more business with the rest of the world.
Yes.
We're sitting on an abundance of resources, but yet we just seem to be moving marginally. What can we do to accelerate the integration of our markets and trade, as well as adding value across borders? I think that's one of the critical issues of our time right now. Just help us understand.
Yes, first and foremost, we have created the African Continental Free Trade Area, a market space for trading.
Absolutely.
The challenge now comes to the business sector to respond. And in my statements, I've always said, since we established the African Continental Free Trade Area, I've never heard a business person across Africa welcoming the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area to say, we are happy that you have established this market, and since it's a large market, we are going to invest so much in this market. And I always challenge the business people, come out of hiding, invest in the market, invest in manufacturing of both final goods and intermediate goods. So the response from the private sector has not been very, very, very encouraging.
But shouldn't the enabling environment and the policies drive that first? And the reason why I ask this is today we're a population of 1.2 billion. 2030, well, 2050, it'll be 2.4 billion. If we don't integrate the market now, the question is when?
Well, some time back there was a study by the African Export-Import Bank which said the stock of infrastructure that we have right now in Africa is capable of increasing intra-African trade. I've forgotten the figure, but relatively large figure. So we are underutilizing the current stock of infrastructure. We need to do more. Because what I would expect the business houses from Africa is to come up with the logistics centers across Africa, warehouses across Africa. I would also expect the shipping the private sector from Africa, the private sector from Africa, to start planning of coming up with any African shipping line. My dream is that one day we are going to have ships moving across Africa both ways, delivering goods and taking them inland. Right now, what we have is a situation where we depend on ships owned by foreigners to ship goods from Africa to the next African country, and before they come to Africa, they have to go to Amsterdam and other places. So it comes back to the issue of the business. We are sitting on potential. The business sector has not really fully responded. Now, that also brings in another dimension. And before I answer directly, let me congratulate the Minister of Finance for Ethiopia to establish the stock exchange. But however, I would like to warn you that in quite a number of African countries, they established stock exchanges, and the initial number of companies that listed on those stock exchanges, as of today, this is still the same number. It has not increased. Now, why is that so? Because our enterprises, most of them, do not grow into big enterprises. They cannot afford to list on the stock markets. Now, when you do that, you come up with bigger enterprises, and they have the capacity now to undertake large-scale investments, such as coming up with the logistics centers, warehouses, and also the shipping centers, and even freight companies to move goods across the continent. So the challenge is the private sector. Now, when you look at the challenge of the private sector, if you Google right now, you Google Africa Wealth Report 2024. What you'll find there is that the aggregate investable wealth of the African billionaires, centimillionaires, and the ordinary millionaires is $2.5 trillion. They are not investing that money because they don't see any opportunities. Okay. So why is the problem?
So Ambassador, it does seem to me, therefore, that there's an opportunity for a convergence between the African Union, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the African Development Bank, other development partners, and the private sector, a major convening to move this forward. As you said, even in terms of logistics, moving a container of goods from Dubai or China to Africa costs much less than it does shipping the same volume of goods from Ghana to Nigeria and vice versa. So in terms of the value chains that need to be developed, the logistics, as well as the increasing role that AI is going to play, what can we do? You've talked about some of this, but rather than wait for the private sector, can we have a convening as quickly as possible with all the major stakeholders coming to the table to move us to the next level?
Well, the African Development Bank already has a platform, the African Investment Platform. Then the question is...
Which is business-based, but we're talking about the convergence of policies.
Okay, I'll come to that. Yes, they are doing very well. Now, within the margins of this ongoing Assembly of the African Union, I think either on the 15th or on the 16th, we are going to bring together the Pan-African financial institutions and African business people.
Fantastic.
And the question is, what do you want us to do for you to unlock your investments? Let's hope they'll respond. But as we ask that question, the business people always challenge them to say, on your own, ask yourself, what can I do to contribute to the progress of my continent? It's two ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not just a question of incentives. They should also try to look for opportunities and seize them. And when they see the opportunity, they say, we are going to take advantage of that. Absolutely. Now, back to the issue of growth of big businesses. The World Bank, I don't know which, one of the economist intelligence unit, they came up with the report around December. Their assessment was that the problem with most of the African businesses is that there are so many small-scale enterprises.
True.
And most of them do not grow into big enterprises. So we needed to create conditions where they can grow. And it's a question of also the businesses also creating the conditions where they can grow. And I always give the example of a Chinese company, SANY, Sunny. 34 years ago, it was a small metal fabricator. And when it established itself, its basic strategy was that we should invest 5% of gross revenue every year into innovation and research and development. And they were very disciplined. They did that. They used that money to go around the world to buy small enterprises as a source of transfer technology. Today, it's a multinational company operating in Africa and other parts of the world. That's the challenge that we give African entrepreneurs to say, come out and say, how can I contribute under the present conditions to the progress of my continent?
Thank you.
But before I leave, let me indicate that the issue of reform of the global financial architecture came into the picture. The African Union now is a permanent member of the G20. Absolutely. And we are very much seized with the situation. We are dealing with it in the G20. And to ensure that we come up with the policy-based and policy-driven proposals in this issue and several others, we decided to create African Union-level knowledge partners. And the African Development Bank is one of our knowledge partners. So we'll be working together to ensure that we drive the process of reform of the global financial architecture from an African point of view. Thank you. Okay. And may I now be excused because I have to go and close the meeting somewhere.
Honorable Muchanga, just before you go, I just want to say a very big thank you for your points there. And you make a very, very valid point on the need for scaling up enterprises on the continent to bring together the best of talent, the best of technology, the best of money, whether that's through acquisitions, whether that's partnerships or the creation of conglomerates. That's really the future. And we want to say a very big thank you. Thank you for your time, and we wish you all the very best during the summit. Okay. Which now takes me to my dear sister, Nena Nwabufo. You've heard from the Honorable Ambassador Muchanga. You've also heard from our other panelists. Again, it's all about resilience in the midst of multiple shocks. Africa is resilient, and it will continue to be. What are those things that you see that countries can do to further build their resilience and better position them for development and growth?
Africa is resilient, but I think there are still quite a lot of opportunities that the countries can take. Our resilience in Africa has mostly been reactive and also at the primary level. You find that Africa still has a long way to go in terms of structural transformation and diversifying its economy. A lot of African countries still depend on one commodity. There were countries that depended on tourism. COVID came. Everywhere was shut down. It was chaos. There are countries that depend on mostly agricultural produce and without even any value addition. Even during COVID, you found that most of those countries couldn't export their products. Remember some countries were thriving with agricultural produce and small industrialization. They discover oil. Everybody abandons those and they run away. So we need to diversify the economy so that our countries can be dependent on more than one sector. So, and not only being dependent on more than one sector, we need to, Africa has the capacity in agriculture to feed itself and feed the world. But what we are lacking is value addition. The value chain is increased and they are imported back in Africa. We buy them. So there has to be some kind of diversification. Depending on more than one sector, we need to look at agricultural value chains. We need to look at manufacturing, even if it is small manufacturing. We need to look at services. And one area that Africa is growing is in the technology area. We have fintech areas that Africa is showing possibilities. So governments need to pay attention to these areas and grow them much more. And of course, you've heard the commissioner talk about movement of trade and goods, logistics centers. We have one of the fastest growing populations around the world. We have a huge population in Africa. Logistics is going to be key if we are going to grow our trade. So there are opportunities for countries to diversify their economy. But one low-hanging fruit that I see is that we need to build strong economic policy framework so that we can enhance our microeconomic stability, because that's one area where Africa is being shaken all the time. So we need some kind of coordination between our monetary and our fiscal policy, because it's important that we ensure that fiscal spending will align with what the central bank actions are. Sometimes you find that those two are not aligning. So, and therefore, we need to make sure that these align and they work hand in hand in order to avoid debt monetization when we are trying to bring down inflation and at the same time. The other thing is also governments need to adopt measures for capital flow management, because we need to tame disruptive outflows and foreign exchange interventions that could be part of the policy response. This could be part of the policy response that we need to substitute for necessary macroeconomic adjustments. We also heard about the conversation about the African Financial Stability Mechanism that the bank has been talking about and driving to say, when European countries run into problems, they have the EU system, financial system. Well, when Africa runs into a problem, we don't have a financial system to bring about the stability that we need. We've also talked about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which everybody says is a game changer. But it can only be a game changer if it's implemented. If governments drive the policies, if governments make sure that the policies that they sign to are implemented. We talked about the private sector, what they can bring to the African Continental Free Trade Area, but has the government put in place the environment through which the private sector can come?
So for somebody who's a lead player on the African landscape in terms of infrastructure, I think the African Development Bank is the largest investor of infrastructure on the continent. What is it that the bank is doing to further enhance integration, to make sure that the vision, the dreams of the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes a reality? It's one thing for us to, again, look to countries and maybe the African Union. What is it, for those who may not be familiar with what the bank is doing, is happening out there in Cote d'Ivoire and in the different regions?
Now, of course, we know that enhancing regional integration in the continent requires tackling the huge infrastructure gap we have in Africa. And the bank, over the years, has invested at least 50 billion in this sector, whether it's road connectivity, whether it's supporting seaports, whether it is in railway. And some of the examples, one, at least until recently, I was in East Africa. The bank has built roads to connect Kenya to Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya to Sudan, Tanzania. We currently, as we know, Tanzania is involved in a massive railway, building railways. We have invested about 700 million to support connectivity between Tanzania and Burundi in terms of railway, and we leverage that 700 million as a lead arranger to raise we are raising about 3.2 billion to support that infrastructure. We have also built bridges that are connecting Senegal and Gambia is a very good example. We have the Kasungula Bridge that is connecting Botswana and Zambia. We have the Nakala Corridor that is linking Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. And so we have a very big track record in this area. Even the African Continental Free Trade Area, working with the African Union when it was being established, the bank invested $5 million to support the establishment of the African Continental Trade Area. This was in 2020.
That's the headquarters in Ghana.
In Ghana.
Yeah.
And in 2022, we provided an additional amount of equivalent of about 11 million to strengthen the functioning of the Secretariat, to make sure that it can work with other development partners to make sure that they realize the full potential.
And in less than 1 minute, how optimistic are you that we can accelerate Africa's integration a whole lot further than we have right now, given the urgency of now? How optimistic are you?
I'm very optimistic. I'm very, because one, besides what we've done so far, the bank is supporting in building payment systems. We've already succeeded in building payment systems across all the countries in East Africa. We are also supporting in terms of building internet connectivity. We are also supporting in terms of making sure that digital infrastructure is available to support. But I think, and as you know, on Tuesday, we launched the 9th edition of the African Visa Openness Index, because we are trying to encourage African countries to open up to other Africans to come and invest.
Okay.
Integration is not going to be done when people cannot cross our borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to come to, before the Honorable Minister leaves, I'm going to come to Dr. Mutai Maruping, the chairperson of the Africa Risk Capacity Group Board. We've heard a lot about the issues of perception, risk perceptions on the African continent, and the impact that that has on investments. What is it that you think can be done to mitigate this? How much of a factor is it? And will the development of an indigenous African credit rating agency be the solution? And how realistic is that from your perspective?
No,
I know it's a lot of questions in one.
Yes, and you have every right to do so. So many questions before us on the continent. Thank you very much for
And if you
having
could
me.
kindly raise your microphone just a
Yeah,
little bit more.
and I want to really allow me to congratulate the team that put together the document, very comprehensive, given the circumstances. So, Professor Uruma and your team, we congratulate you. From the word go, I want to point out that you know, it's a mathematical fluke when we see the growth rates or real growth rate. We must be careful that it's dependent also on the base. The least developed the country is when it makes some strides, the percentage is very high, very impressive. Unlike as the country grows, a given percentage is a given percentage of a large amount. So we have to be careful. So least developed countries really have to be in the double digit, preferably. And then those that are higher already, then we can be talking about 7, 8, and so on. Okay, right. 2, aggregates hide a lot. And, I'm sure, although we must aggregate sometimes, but the variance can be very, very, very wide. Among countries and within countries, distribution, so they can hide quite a lot. So as we read the report, we have to have this at the back of our minds. So I see that what I'm being called upon to address very briefly really is the question of whether the African economies are being accurately evaluated, and then also what can we do to enhance credit worthiness. If I repeat some of the things, but they are relevant to enhancing or to doing that, it's like a song, you know, a refrain. When you go to chorus to make a point, the message is in the chorus. So some of the things Professor Oruma had mentioned. One of the first things to go for that accuracy in evaluation is accurate, you know, is to strengthen the statistics function in our countries. We have to ensure that we have comprehensive data, that it, you know, we're talking about scope here or adequacy. We have to have accurate data. We have to have punctual data. It has to be punctual, not stale, because that will be passé, that will be something that is far off, so that you can adopt a proper remedial action. So accuracy, timeliness, adequacy in scope are very important. So that way we will get a very clear still picture as well as the motion picture. Then we know policy measures, how deep do we go? You know, it's like a doctor assessing you, and then the dosage, you know, what kind of medication, the dosage, how frequent, and so on. You need that data to do the same with the economy. So we have this sketchy data so far. Once upon a time, I was governor of the central bank, and I remember whenever the IMF and the World Bank came for Article 4 consultations, they would be going around and working with guesstimates, interpolations and extrapolations, maybe some even guesses, I guess. If they were friendly to you, they would give you a good report. If they had issues with you, they would give a negative one. So really, our countries have to join the ongoing data revolution. Now, about enhancing credit thing. So, our bottom line is that I don't see perceptions, I see misperceptions of the African risk. That's what is going on now. But let's make sure that Africa brings to fruition the African Union's call for or commitment to silencing the gangs across the continent, really. It may be hard, but let's pursue it, really. Very hard, because that is very important in enhancing credit worthiness. And let's go to the old staple. It may be an old song, but it is as valid as it was when it was composed, this song. And that is good governance, functional governance institutions are very efficient, they have to be functioning and working well. Rule of law, transparency, and accountability. They must be seen to be practiced. Okay. We have to combat illicit financial outflows. ECA, in conjunction with the African Union Commission, had a beautiful study under the leadership of President Mbeki. And they were supposed to work on the modalities, but I had left the African Union Commission at that time to how to actually stop that. Then there is this question of infrastructure, both hard and soft, but I think that has been adequately addressed, and we are grateful to the African Development Bank with its high fives, because the infrastructure features there, but also the flagship projects within Agenda 2063. Then I want to underline that meticulous macroeconomic management is very important, but it must have a human face. We shouldn't just be chasing figures there without a human face. And that's what had been lacking originally when these structural adjustment programs were started. Human face. And then we have to maintain really deepening our financial sectors as much as possible, and financial inclusion. And realizing that aspiration which has been discussed of economic integration. And this is the challenge to our RECs that we have to move. We were talking about free trade area. It's a journey. It's just the beginning of the journey. We are yet to move to the customs union, to the common market, and then to the economic community, because then the creditors would be looking at a larger, integrated economies than disjointed thing. Okay, and then the international, last point, the skewed international financial architecture is very skewed, and it has to be dealt with. Now, credit rating, well, they have to reform themselves, because they are using archaic methods. They are using superficial information. They don't engage with the institutions in the countries that are concerned. And they are often swayed by the narrative of the international media, which of course takes pleasure in bashing Africa. You can't make it as a good journalist in international media houses unless you are a good Africa basher. So you have to,
I think, Dr. Merrill,
you're
opening up a huge can of worms there.
I know I'm being provocative, but
unfortunately, there's much validity to what you said. I remember a number of years ago, I was looking at the BBC, the BBC's front page on its website, and there were about 7 stories on Africa, and there was not a single one of them that was positive. I'm of the opinion that some of that many times is deliberate. And if it's not deliberate, then it's the result of intellectual laziness, which means that somewhere down the road, we as Africans need to own our own narrative and also shape it. Dr. Marapeng, allow me to quickly come to Mr. Amayehu Tafese for a very quick intervention here, and I'm going to allow you just 1 to 2 minutes to provide closing comments, and we'll bring this very fast-paced event to a close. So, Mr. Tafese, we've heard quite a bit about some of the challenges that we're facing, the shocks that we're facing, and one of those has been in the ag and food space. Spiraling food prices, which again have led to inflation. If there are 3 things that African countries can and must do on a continent with an abundance of land, an abundance of labor, water resources, and interconnected markets, what are those 3 critical things that we should be doing to move the agenda forward? And I ask this question very deliberately because for many Africans, the greatest proportion of their spending and their income goes to food, not accommodation, to food. And in many countries at the moment, it's even impossible to have 3, let's not even talk about 3 square meals a day. I think even just having one round meal a day is a challenge. In the paradox of plenty, what is it that we can and must do to change the picture?
Thank you.
Comments from you, and then we'll take closing comments and bring our event to a close this afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if you could speak directly into your microphone, maybe raise it a little higher. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So this is a very critical question. There are 2 ways of looking at it. The first is mitigation. The other is creating resilience. In terms of mitigation, I would be brief. It is necessary to have at least 3 major interventions, policy interventions at the country and regional level. The first of those is an effective early warning system that tracks food crisis situations and enable policymakers and others to identify where these crisis areas are, what are their sources, and how to address them. The second related intervention would be having an anticipatory action framework. A lot of assistance for emergencies come after the crisis has occurred, not before, and by then the damage may have been already done. Obviously, lives are saved as a result, but the longer consequences in terms of productivity may have taken place already. So it is useful to have these anticipatory action plans which identify responsibilities, allocate resources, and also shift the focus from immediate reaction to a more long-term solution. The third item in terms of mitigation I would like to highlight are social protection systems. These are obviously programs which provide assistance to the vulnerable, and they serve in non-crisis times to support and boost the welfare and capabilities of those vulnerable ones. But at times of crisis, they provide protection. And these obviously would be an important element that many countries can adopt. Many did, but again, access, particularly by the poor, is still limited. So it is important to get there. Now, at the core of all this challenge of shocks is our circumstances. First, agriculture is still with low productivity. and it is operating in changing circumstances with population growth, fragile environment, climate change, fragile institutions, including conflict, and also, but the potentials that you outlined, land, water, young population, and so on. This is a multidimensional problem, and more recent understanding of that has shifted the orientation to have a food system transformation perspective, where this systemic approach is adopted. But because you asked me to identify three things, I would mention very quickly what they need to be. One is agricultural productivity has to increase significantly, and this requires investment in productivity-enhancing technologies, including improved seeds and climate-smart technologies, irrigation, animal breeds, and so on. Second, agricultural commercialization has to be accelerated significantly, because that opens up the positive feedback loop between markets and productivity or production to the future. And the third, which has been talked about already here, and that is expand inter-Africa trade in agricultural commodities, such that we have a more reliable food supply. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tafese. I'm going to allow our panelists to provide closing comments here, very short, 1 to 2 minutes. Give us your take, not just for what we've heard, but what you believe that we need to do moving forward. I'm going to start with the Honorable Minister from Gambia, His Excellency Mr. Sidi Keita, who is online, I trust is still online, to provide the first closing comments, and we'll start with our panelists and end with our Honorable Minister from Ethiopia. Again, kindly bear with us, Honorable Minister. I know you have to run. Well, let's do that. Honorable Minister from Gambia, Minister Keita, your closing comments.
Thank you very much. I thank all my colleague panelists for this launching session. I think the closing comment I would say is increasingly more and more as Africans willing to look inward. We need to build our institutions. We need to use digitalization and maximize revenue collection domestically, whilst taking account of the vulnerable segment of society, and ensure that the low and middle income earners are not adversely impacted by the enhanced domestic resource mobilization drive. Another area is to ensure that we trade more as a continent. If you look at the interregional trade, it's so low. If you look across African borders, it takes such a long time for goods to move from one country in Africa to another. And all these inefficiencies are added onto the cost of goods in the continent. This is artificially increasing the cost of living, and these barriers are not adding any value to the process. If you compare other European countries and other parts of the world, movements of goods and people within those regions are very fluid. So for Africa to grow, that must also be looked at.
Thank you.
The third element I would focus on is investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure is the artery to any economic development. So we must invest in the road and digital network, as well as electricity, to ensure that our citizens can be able to move from place to place with the least hindrance and within the shortest possible time, have access to affordable and reliable electricity, as well as having access to the digital world through technology.
Thank you very much,
All these reforms, digital domestic resource mobilization, cannot be done by only policy changes, but digital solution is the way forward. And to do so, you need a strong digital backbone, affordable and reliable internet connectivity, so that services can thrive.
Honorable
I think
Minister,
these are my interventions, and I appreciate the effort of the recommendations in the report. I hope as Africans, we should do less talk now and work more on delivery.
I would say a very big amen to that. Honorable Minister, thank you very much for those closing comments, and you're doing a fantastic job in the Gambia with the reforms that you're implementing, as well as the government of the Gambia. I'm going to go to Mr. Tafese for your closing comments. Again, 60 seconds to 120 seconds, 1 to 2 minutes each.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think.
And if you could speak directly into your microphone, sir.
I think there are a lot of ideas, plans, aspirations, and policy interventions that we have heard today, and we have been hearing all along, and successes also. So I think the key in the future, the key direction should be implementation capacity. From the design stage, it is important to think about implementation and also invest in implementation capacity such that policies and interventions are implemented, monitored, and become successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tafese. And we're going to come to Dr. Maroping for your closing comments.
Yes, 4 points. One, African countries should stay the course in implementing Agenda 2063. The next 10 implementation plan was adopted last year by the summit. 2, African Development Bank should stay the course with the high fives. They are very pregnant, and they really enrich Agenda 2063. 3, an indigenous rating agency would be a good idea, basing itself on objective and basing itself on quality data, which we hope can come by. 4, credit rating would go up knowing, or raters knowing that as we do all these developmental efforts, in the background, I think as he was saying, there is capacity for early warning systems and capacity to deal with climate change caused disasters. And that's where Africa risk capacity comes in.
Thank you.
So it should be supported. Thank you very much.
Dr. Maroping. Mrs. Nena Nwabufo, your closing comments.
Thank you. Two things quickly. I think when Professor Rama spoke, he spoke about debt productivity, because debt is not so bad, but it's what you do with debt. So I think countries should begin to focus on what productivity can they drive with the debt they contract, especially the external debt. The second thing I would like to talk about is this credit rating agency for Africa. The question is, if you have an African credit rating agency, are people going to, can you use that to leverage your borrowing in the international market? It may not be so. But up till now, the African countries, organizations, we do not have a basis to challenge and to question the international credit rating agencies. So if we have one that is growing in Africa, we can use that as a basis to challenge whatever is coming. And once we begin to challenge, I think the topic on redefining the financial architecture will change, because it will give us the basis to say, we have been cheated so far. We have the basis to prove you wrong. We want a new financial architecture that will give Africa a more favorable platform. Thank you.
Very excellent point there. And in addition to what the chief economist, Professor Rama, said earlier, factoring the value of Africa's natural and green wealth. We're going to leave the last closing comment, but certainly not the least, to our host minister today, Mr. Shide. Please, your own closing comments.
Africa's development is a global public good, and the partnership is very important. But most importantly is the national ownership. Countries should own its development paths, and the commitment has to be internally driven, but also most importantly globally supported, because Africa's comprehensive development is a global public good. Ethiopia, for the last 7 years, under the leadership of Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed, has demonstrated sustained strong growth, diversified growth, and the private sector-led growth, while addressing the macroeconomic imbalance, which also paving the way to attract FDI by improving the ease of doing business. So I would like to say four issues are very important. Leadership is very important. The last 6 years demonstrates significant economic policy reform, macroeconomic reform, and development-oriented government intervention. This is a result of quality of intention and quality of attention by the whole leadership, championed and of course led by the Prime Minister. So leadership is very important. Second, the whole government approach. Ethiopia's macroeconomic reform, we have come from state-led growth to more towards private sector-led growth. And a lot of economic reform and opening up and liberalization required bold leadership and whole government approach. And most of the agendas of economic reform is well-crafted, internally debated, consensus is reached. So the whole government approach is another very important issue. The third is massive public participation. For example, the Green Legacy Initiative, championed by the Prime Minister, for the last 6 years, we are able to plant seedlings up to 40 billion. Tens of millions of Ethiopians every year during rainy season voluntarily participating on seedlings. And this is significantly boosting afforestation program. So as a result of this approach, in addition to that, the role of the private sector, some of the initiative of the government to diversify the economy, for example, in terms of greening urban cities, making cities livable, tourism destination development, is not only financed by traditional resource mobilization. A lot of voluntary contribution by the private sector has enabled those investments. So the role of the private sector is very important. As a result of this holistic approach, Ethiopia has sustained huge investment on infrastructure. Most of our debt is quality debt. I say quality because we have created railway, we have created expressway, we have created hydroelectric dams, we have built a lot of transmission lines, we have created sugar industries. All of the debt Ethiopia owed to international creditors, we created quality assets, generating significant return for the economy. Not necessarily cash, but economic return for the whole economy. That is also driving Ethiopia's growth agenda. Agricultural development, industrial capacity building, export promotion, all this is significantly contributing to our growth. And digitalization, particularly under the Prime Minister's championship, we have expanded financial inclusion, digital financial services, and digital government services. And this is significantly enhancing productivity also. Green development is another area. Most of the infrastructure development in Ethiopia has also regional dimensions. Railway, we built it together with Djibouti. The express roads, it is toward Djibouti or Somalia or Kenya. The energy, we are the largest exporter in the region, exporting to Kenya, to Sudan, to also Djibouti. We are now building the second line to Djibouti. So Ethiopia and its development trajectory is not only benefiting Ethiopians, but also benefiting the entire region. That's why regional integration, regional solidarity is very important. So local ownership, local commitment with global support is a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, that's an excellent note to bring this very robust session to a close. Just really 8 quick points here. Less talk, more action, implementation, capacity investment, stay the course on Agenda 2063 and the high fives, an indigenous ratings agency based on credible data, external debt productivity and quality debt, national ownership of the development agenda, leadership and a whole government approach rather than silos, green legacy initiatives, agricultural transformation, as well as the deepening of a digital economy. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, really, this has been a very fascinating tour de force of the 2025 macroeconomic report. I just want to end by saying Africa's future is not predetermined by global shocks or uncertainties, but rather by the bold choices we, the people, make. Let us leave this room today with a shared commitment to translate data into decisive policies, challenges into opportunities, and potential into prosperity. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely thank you on behalf of the organizers of this event for your patience, We've run out of time, unfortunately, and I know our Honorable Minister and some of the other panelists have to run on to some other sessions. This has been an excellent time. Thank you to the Chief Economist and to his team. We look forward to the report that you're going to release tomorrow. This has been my pleasure moderating and emceeing this event. My name is Victor Ladokun. I wish you a great afternoon, bon appetit, and have an excellent stay here in Addis Ababa. God bless you.